31 degrees Celsius. Really is going to be quite a hot and sticky day for areas in the south and east. Holding on to some evening sunshine though, and the rain in the far northwest gradually clearing its way off and allowing clear intervals for many of us overnight. Our winds are shifting to a bit more of a westerly direction, and that's helping to feed in some slightly less humid air for tonight. So temperatures tonight will be dropping slightly lower compared to where they were last night, particularly in the west around 11, 12 degrees Celsius, still 14, 15 further east, but a touch more comfortable for sleeping compared to last night. Monday then starts off on a bright and sunny note for many of us, but we will start to see some scattered showers bubbling up, particularly across the northern half of the UK. Again, southern areas likely staying driest, and we'll see some sunny intervals throughout the afternoon, even if a little bit hazy at times. Temperatures, though, notably down compared to where we will see them today, only seeing highs of around 22, 23 degrees across areas of the south east. Some longer spells of rain, though, as we head towards the middle part of the week. Still some sunshine in between, and in that sunshine, feeling pleasantly warm around the low 20s. Enjoy your day. Bye-bye.
Like all families, we have arguments every now and then, but actually we agree on what the mission of GB News is, and that's the most fundamentally important thing.
GB News provides the kind of platform that lets all voices be heard.
We don't hold back. We're free to say what we really think. Just because some people who live in a tiny little Westminster bubble think that their particular story is important, that's not the most important story for me.
And often they will be difficult stories, stories that you won't find on the establishment media.
Because what people think in the north of England may be very different to what they're thinking in the home counties.
We're going to carry on telling the world what life is really like for households up and down the UK.
We love to be in your car, in your kitchen as you're having your breakfast. Whatever you're doing, you are part of the show. If it matters to you, it matters to us.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates. Do you not believe in prison?
I don't believe in prisons.
I'm completely stunned. I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed. So I guess they've always been quite woke. That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel. Britain's news channel.
Nightmare commute. Kick it up a gear with me, Patrick Christie's, at drive time, 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News Radio. You can listen online and on DAB+, on the smart speaker app and on the GB News app. And if you've got an Alexa, all you have to say is, Alexa, play GB News. We're also on TuneIn and the Radio Player apps. From the school run to rush hour, get revved up with me, Patrick Christie's, on GB News and GB News Radio.
So Jubes and Kerr, we tackle the issues of the day with real robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is 2 new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat.
Did you know Kate Moss?
Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good morning and welcome to the Camilla Tominey Show. Thank you for joining me on this Sunday morning where it's been quite a momentous weekend for news. Of course, we're going to be keeping you up to date with all of the latest from Russia. We're also going to be discussing the economy, which has been a major theme this week, with Britain's debt now 100% of GDP, inflation rates the highest in the G7 in the UK. John Glenn, the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, is going to be joining me. I'm also going to be speaking to Sir Jake Berry, former chairman of the Conservative Party, who I think is going to be quite critical of Andrew Bailey and the Bank of England, probably justifiably so. Jonathan Powell, former Downing Street Chief of Staff to former Prime Minister Tony Blair, will join me. He was Chief of Staff when Vladimir Putin was elected in 1999, so I'll be very interested in his take on what's been going on with the Wagner Group. Kwasi Quateng, former Chancellor of the Exchequer under Liz Truss, is going to be joining me in the studio to discuss whether Trussonomics may be slowly being vindicated with the economic calamity that we've witnessed in recent days and weeks. Sir Malcolm Rifkind, again, another Tory heavyweight, former Foreign Secretary, former Defence Secretary, is going to be with me to discuss Russia, as is Tony Abbott, former Australian Prime Minister, the man who famously stopped the boats in Australia. You couldn't wish for a better lineup, folks. It's a very strong lineup. Do stay tuned because we're going to get through a hell of a lot. Now, let's go through the front pages. First of all, the Sunday Telegraph front page. Again, of course, it's the Russian situation. Wagner mutineers turned back after striking deal with Putin. We're going to try and delve into that story and find out exactly what has gone on, because it does seem interesting that yesterday they're obviously 200 miles out from Moscow and then today some deal has clearly been struck. Sunday Times, Putin clings on after mutiny. The Observer also going with that story, so papers from right to left quite understandably focusing on foreign policy. Rebel chief halts tank advance on Moscow to stop bloodshed. Mail on Sunday again, the question we'll be asking during the show of my various guests, can Putin hold on? Sunday Express sums it up nicely, doesn't it? Russia on the brink. And then the Sun on Sunday, Putin at the brink. Can I be a grammar pedant and say, shouldn't it be Putin on the brink? Anyway, leave that to the headline writers at The Sun. And then the Sunday Mirror, Putin pushed to brink. The word brink is doing a lot of heavy lifting, and I'm going to ask questions now of David Maddox, who is the political editor of The Express Online. Great to see you this morning, David.
Hi, Camilla.
Thank you for joining me. It's quite something, isn't it, to have had what has gone on in the last 24 to 48 hours. Wagner Group staging what we thought was a coup, and now, what do we think? He's been bought off by Putin. You've got Lukashenko, the Belarusian president, brokering some kind of peace deal. Your reactions, David, and how are the papers covering all this?
It was an incredible day yesterday. You know, we all thought that Moscow might fall to this as they were going up the M4. Literally, I think that's the name of the road.
The Russian motorway, the M4.
And then suddenly it stops. And I don't think we've really got to the bottom of what the deal was that stopped him. But clearly he's been
Prigozhin is
bought off.
a kind of homicidal maniac. He's somebody who punishes deserters with a sledgehammer.
Yes.
I think the big question yesterday, apart from the fear about civil war going on in a country with nuclear weapons, is, I mean, what would be better for the West? President Putin continuing or President Prigozhin and his murderous regime?
From the people I spoke to yesterday, President Prigozhin might have been the one thing that was worse than President Putin.
Quite.
So it was, but it was interesting seeing how the papers have covered. I mean, it's a kind of front page editor's dream, really.
Isn't it? The Sun on Sunday, Putin at the brink of revolution of the weekend. Lots and lots of analysis. What's interesting, I suppose, from the Western perspective is where it does live Putin.
Yes.
There's a lot of commentary. You've picked out a piece by Robert Toombs. What's he saying in the Sunday Telegraph?
Well, he's looking at it from a historical perspective. Is this 1917 again, which, of course, is when Tsar Nicholas famously was deposed, and it ended up with the October Revolution sometime after that, with the Bolsheviks coming in. But I think he's kind of leaning towards it being more like 1944, the failed coup against Hitler, which, of course, weakened Hitler, but he then stayed on and took revenge on the generals involved in that. And one could only imagine that Putin's got something similar in mind if he manages to hold power.
Do we think that Prigozhin's days are numbered? I mean, he's obviously been bought off for now. He's over in Belarus. I mean, I'd be watching my tea for Novichok, I've got to be honest.
I'd be making sure there's no ice picks lying
Yes.
around, which is, the famous thing that took out, Stalin had his assassins use. So it's, I can't believe he's feeling particularly safe at the moment.
And where does it leave the Wagner Group in relation to the Ukraine? Because on one hand, we didn't have much resistance from Russian troops yesterday as the Wagner Group continued to sort of march towards Moscow. Obviously, they look up to the Wagner Group. They captured Bakhmut. They're kind of like the extreme end of the military wedge in Russia. Is this something that benefits Ukraine overall, do we think, David?
Well, I think division inevitably benefits Ukraine, and the fact that Putin is now weakened, and clearly the Wagner Group are not happy. I mean, they've not marched on Moscow, but they're clearly not happy. So, yes, it will benefit Ukraine. And, of course, there's been discussion of Ukraine pushing forward anyway and recapturing land and pushing the Russians out. And they must spy an opportunity now.
Look, there's other things in the paper, not least our own economic situation domestically, which may or may not have been exacerbated by the Ukraine situation. Sunday Times, PM feels the squeeze and there's no rate escape. He's stuck between a rock and a hard place here. These deliverables aren't being delivered. Rishi Sunak, so-called man of economic stability, and it's all gone very, very pear-shaped.
Yes, and I'll be interested to hear what Kwasi has to say to you later, because I think Liz Truss and Kwasi are feeling more justified by the day. But I mean,
are there? You have people who criticise them heavily, saying, no, it was the mini-budget, what did it?
It's becoming, the guilt rates, the infamous guilt rates, which none of us quite understood, are now worse than during the mini-budget. And, this Sunday Times piece is fascinating, actually. It reflects a lot of what I was being told this week. But, Frank Luntz, the famous pollster, saying to Conservative MPs that anybody with a majority of less than 15,000 is likely gone. I mean, we're talking about...
could jeopardise our very own...
Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Sir Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Sir Jacob, yes.
He might be doing more broadcasting on GB News.
And in fact,
come 2024.
Certainly your guest, Sir Jake Berry, will also be...
he's on that. I'm going to ask him about his reaction to Luntz, because obviously he's a former party chairman. Let's also just get into what I've described as weekend woke idiocy. It's this astonishing story in the Mail on Sunday. St Paul's lambasts Churchill as white supremacist. Oh, my God, I'm so sick of these Churchill stories where idiots keep on calling the greatest Briton ever to have lived a white supremacist. He was a man of his time, but what the hell is this revisionist history going on?
It astonishes me. I mean, if it's not the National Trust, you can rely on the Church of England to outwoke anybody these days. But, literally attacking the man who defeated fascism in the 20th century seems to be a weird obsession.
This caption was written. We don't quite know how it was written, why it was written, but it's been pulled. So they've described Churchill as a controversial figure, but it initially said what, David? So
he is also a figure of controversy, as he was an unashamed imperialist and white supremacist. Well, he was a Victorian. He was born in the 1870s. Of course, he was in favour of a British Empire. He was a man of his day.
Yeah, nobody says he's perfect, but he was responsible for defeating Hitler and freeing the Western world from the tyranny of Nazi rule. But, let's overlook that.
And actually, if we go back to that first, the big story of the weekend, the defeat of fascism in Europe is a constant, thing of importance, huge importance, and we should be celebrating him.
Let's just lighten the mood a little, David, before you go. Kate is once again in sportswear on the front of the papers. Tell us about this. She's been having a knocking up in tennis with none other than Roger Federer.
Yeah, well, we know she loves her tennis.
I'm just looking on the front of the Sunday Express. She's looking very athletic.
So it's very good of the Sunday Express to put her on the front. Actually, a few papers did this week. It would have been a normal front page staple.
Does she sell papers if she's on the front, do you reckon?
Well, my old editor used to dispute that, but, she's immensely popular. It kind of reminds you that there are things to be cheerful about.
Yes.
And there are good things in this country. There's some sort of stability somewhere.
Also, it's a positive news story for Royals rather than anything
Exactly.
David Maddox, thank you for joining me this morning. Really lovely to speak to you. Now, of course, we've got the People's Panel, and I tell you what, they're going to have their work cut out because we've got so many great guests. I'm very intrigued to know from Catherine Forster, who's in Uxbridge. We chose Uxbridge, naturally, because we wanted to see what the kind of post-Boris effect is there. And I'd love to know, Catherine, what questions the panel would like me to put to the guests that I've got today. John Glenn, Kwasi Quateng, I've got Tony Abbott. I've got them all. Catherine, what are they saying?
Yes, good morning, Camilla, from sunny Uxbridge. We're here at the Harris and Hoole coffee shop. Let's go in and talk to Rihanna quickly. Rihanna, thanks so much for having us. Costs are going up for everybody, but how's business?
Even with the cost increase here, we still got daily regular business. We get the regulars in.
And you have great coffee.
We have the best coffee in Uxbridge. So even people moving to the areas, they just come here.
Great. Thank you so much for having us. OK, let's meet our panel. Thank you so much, chaps, for coming along on this very, very hot day. Jack, I'm going to talk to you first. You are an NHS worker. You're also an actor.
Yeah.
Very concerned, as is pretty much everybody, about the cost of living. Tell us about your own personal experience.
Everything has gone up, from supermarkets, council tax, mortgages. Mortgages have tripled for me, personally. My gas and electric bills tripled. Everything is a real struggle. I'm on the minimum wage, £10.40 an hour, subcontractor for the NHS. I need to work at least 70 hours a week to bring in about £700, which is about the amount you need, just to not go backwards. So it's very hard. And I don't think the people in power really understand what's going on. It's the worst it's ever been. Excuse me.
You have a specific question for them on that line, don't you?
Yeah. Do you know how bad it is out here? It is really, really bad. I've never known things to be this bad in all my years, and I'm 63. Yeah.
Yes, really difficult times for many people. Let's talk to Thomas now. Thomas, thank you for joining us. You're currently disabled, but you were a decorator and a driver. You had a huge heart attack a month ago. Tell us about your experience.
Well, I called 999 and I waited patiently for 45 minutes, being told 20 to half an hour. When I called back, they said, "I'm sorry, we don't give times. Can you get off the line? This is busy." I then called a neighbour who called 111. The ambulance came. It took an hour all told, but Harefield Hospital whizzed me straight through. I'm lucky to be here. Thank you very much to the National Health Service. And my heart goes out to those that haven't survived because of this, because they should respond quicker, or at least stay on the phone with you, because I was scared. I was on my own.
Yes, the target for Category 2 calls, I think, is 18 minutes. So very, very fortunate to be here. And finally, to you, Philip, you used to have a very senior role in IT, but you're currently a full-time carer for your father. You're interested in the impact of fatherless households on the economy. You've got a question for John Glenn. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, so I think it's really something to think about and consider as a major impact to the UK economy, and that is the impact of fatherless homes within the UK economy, and how that filters down at a granular level to with the split of the households, and how economically dependent people become as a result of things like high conflict divorce and family separation.
That's an interesting question, because, of course, there are large numbers of households now, aren't there, without a father present. OK, so plenty of food for thought for the politicians, Camilla, from Uxbridge. We look forward to seeing what they have to say. Back to you now.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Catherine. If you want to apply for the panel, don't forget you go to gbnews.com/panel and you'll be able to apply. I'm just going to bring David Maddox back into the conversation because we're waiting for the Chief Secretary of the Treasury, John Glenn, to get mic'd up. He's currently in a location in London. David, now, I'm looking at some of the YouGov polling that's just come out today. We've got the Conservatives on 22%. They're down 2. You've got Labour up to 47%. So that is a 25-point lead. And then on PM approval, Rishi's at 21%, Starmer's at 32%, Not Sure is at 42%. Isn't that just the sign of the times? That actually, despite the fact that Labour are leading, people are still not convinced by Sir Keir Starmer?
No, they're not convinced by him at all, and they're not really convinced by Labour. Labour's strongest card at the moment is a failure of a Conservative government.
Yeah.
and that's the fact of it. They're not really offering anything new or different. And all the polling, I mean, we run a lot of polling with Techni UK as well, and there's, I noticed in our latest one that a third of people are either not going to vote or just can't make up their mind.
Do you think the Conservatives are going to be the victims of apathy come 2024? So many people are saying, look, I can't bring myself to vote for Labour, even though, by the way, economically there's less jeopardy going for Rachel Reeves, because there's only a fag paper seemingly between her and Jeremy Hunt's policies, but I digress.
In fact, Jeremy might be more left-wing, but that's...
Jeremy might be more left... you said that, not me, David. But people are literally saying they are so cross. They are so cross with the Conservatives. They feel that Boris Johnson squandered a golden opportunity, that they're not going to go Lib Dem, halfway house. They're literally just not going to bother.
No, and I think we saw that in the local elections, was actually lots and lots of Conservative voters, including Conservative members and activists, just sitting on their hands. And it's not just the squandered opportunity.
I'm going to leave it there, David, just because I know that John Glenn joins us now. Minister, I hope you can hear me. Thank you very much for joining me this morning. Now, obviously, in your capacity of Chief Secretary of the Treasury, I must ask you about our inflation rate. What interests me is that a couple of Rishi Sunak's deliverables seem undeliverable, Mr Glenn. You've got him wanting to bring inflation down to 5%. That doesn't seem to be manageable within a year. It wasn't even that ambitious a target. He's also talked about bringing down the debt, and yet we found out this week Britain's debt is 100% of GDP. What's going wrong here?
Well, he set out the targets on the 6th of January for this year. I recognise they're challenging targets. He said at the start, although not everyone believed him, that they wouldn't be easy to fulfil. Obviously, what we're facing in terms of inflationary pressures in the UK economy is really significant. We've got three main tools of dealing with that: interest rate policy, my work controlling public spending, and then supporting families through that. You're right to show the fact that we have a significant amount of debt. You know, we shut down the economy 3 years ago, essentially, borrowed a lot of money with a furlough and other support schemes, came out of that with a period of high inflation consequential of the war, and we have higher interest payments as a government due to interest rates going up. That is a very, very challenging set of circumstances, but ones that we're determined to meet. And dealing with inflation is the major threat.
Is some of this the fault of the Bank of England Governor Andrew Bailey? He should have acted much quicker, shouldn't he? If you look back, November 2021, interest rates were still 0.5%. Over in America, they've managed their inflation rate better because they put interest rates up sooner.
Well, the Prime Minister himself was one of the very earliest people in this country to talk about the inflationary pressures when he was Chancellor, when I was working with him as Economic Secretary. As you know, the Bank of England is independent of government. We work closely with them, but they make those decisions.
Have they made the wrong decision?
Increased our rates by 0.5% last week. I'm not here to commentate. I'm here to work closely with the Bank of England. People don't want us to be squabbling amongst ourselves. What we should be doing is having a committed and united plan to deal with high inflation in our economy. That is what we're doing in government, and that is what the Governor of the Bank of England is doing with the interest rate decisions.
One of the panellists on our People's panel has made the point that he doesn't think that government ministers are in touch with the public. The question was from him, do you know how bad it is out there? Are you aware of the risk to people losing their homes? We've got 1.3 million people who they're coming off their fixed rate mortgages very soon. Much is made of household debt, but actually what about businesses? What about businesses that are struggling to pay the bills? Conservatives have put up corporation tax literally on no profits because nobody seems to be making any money. So surely you're worried about businesses folding as well as people struggling to pay their mortgages.
Well, we're worried about all aspects of delivering government policy as effectively as possible. I mean, what I can say to you, of course I'm aware of how difficult this is. I have constituents who email me expressing their concerns. All members of Parliament who are ministers do that. And that's why the Chancellor met with lenders, met with the FCA on Friday, both to challenge them on what's happening in terms of passing on increased interest rates, but also to productively come out with some interventions with respect to being able to move over to interest only for 6 months with no penalties consequential of that, and be able to talk to lenders without any risk to credit rating, as well as clarifying the 12-month interval from repossession.
But why is there talk then, Mr Glenn? Why is there talk then that it might be favourable for us to enter recession in order to bring this inflation rate down? Because people who own small businesses, and indeed people who are worried about their mortgages, will be tearing their hair out. Anyone that's interested in growth will think it's complete economic lunacy to be talking about forcing ourselves into recession. This is managed decline on steroids, isn't it?
Well, I'm not talking about a recession. What I'm talking about is halving inflation, the Prime Minister's top priority. That's what the Chancellor, the Prime Minister and myself are completely
When will that
committed
happen?
To achieving. Well, the Prime Minister has set out the objective to halve inflation by the end of the year, and we are working to that goal. He has said, and I recognise it is going to be challenging to do that, but no doubt you will hold us to account at the end of the year.
You can bet your bottom dollar on that. Thank you very much indeed for joining me this morning, John Glenn.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm now joined by Sir Jake Berry, former chairman of the Conservative Party, an MP who I know has got quite strong views about the Bank of England. Jake, did you hear John Glenn there? He was trying to deflect any blame from Andrew Bailey, but what's your view? Is he to blame for this inflation rate being the highest in the G7?
Well, good morning, Camilla. Look, clearly, and before coming on the show today, I was looking at the Bank of England's predictions just from 18 months ago, and their prediction was that inflation would be 2% now. It's over 8% or 10%, depending on some measures. Look, the Bank of England has been asleep at the wheel. The United Kingdom Central Bank has acted far too slowly, and mortgage payers and businesses are paying the price.
Andrew Bailey, is he just a sort of Treasury orthodoxy stooge? Should he consider his position?
Well, Andrew Bailey is pursuing what I call blobonomics, which is the sort of flawed economic principles of the Treasury. And I think the problem he has is that every prediction he has made is wrong. So I don't want to get into predicting his future because I might fall into the same trap.
But what do you think? Should he consider his position? Should the government consider his position?
I think the government should be getting him in and talking about whether he has a plan other than just ratcheting up inflation or ratcheting up interest rates and mortgages on households. And if he doesn't, then maybe it's time to look for someone else who's got a better plan.
I mean, what are you telling your constituents on the doorstep? Because clearly they'll be very worried about their mortgage payments going up. They're very worried about their bills continuing to rise. I agree that we've had a little bit of a reprieve, haven't we, for our energy bills now over the summer, not least because it's so sunny we're not having to put on the radiators. But, I mean, presumably you are worried about the economy causing you to lose seats come 2024.
Well, look, when I talk to people here in Rossendale and Darwin, Camilla, one of the main things they are concerned about is this huge increase in mortgage rates. So I welcome the Chancellor's progress he made with the banks, enabling people to flick on just to pay the interest rather than the capital sum back for 6 months. I just don't think this crisis is going to be over in 6 months. And that's why I've been calling for a reintroduction of MIRAS, which is a tax cut for everyone with a mortgage, or expanding SMI to people beyond people just on benefits to try and help families. Look, if you read in the papers today, Camilla, you will have seen that there's a potential 10% drop in property prices in the next 12 months predicted. That puts us on the brink of a financial crisis in terms of the amount of wealth that we have in this country invested in property. We absolutely have to act. And I don't think the approach, frankly, of Andrew Bailey at the bank or the sort of government wait-and-see approach is one that is serving my constituents.
Do you think that the recent economic kind of calamity, the idea of debt being now 100% of GDP, the fact that the gilt yields are actually worse than they were under Liz Truss, has in some way vindicated Trussonomics?
Well, I think everyone involved in Truss's government, including me, has to accept that the implementation of the plan left a lot to be desired, just using the art of British understatement. But the view was within that cabinet is that Britain was sort of careering over the cliff and we needed to do a U-turn as quickly as possible. And that could be done by creating growth by cutting taxes. I still think that's the right thing to do. I think there is a sort of managed decline approach from the Bank of England, particularly with the thought that they have to push us into recession as the only way of Britain recovering. I believe in growth, 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 and that's what Liz Truss went for. It's a shame, frankly, we just made such a mess of implementing the policies.
Let's just move on to matters political. We had Frank Luntz, I believe, in the House of Commons last week. He addressed the 1922 committee. He basically said to Tory MPs, if you've got a majority of 15,000 or less, quotes, you're likely gone. Jake, I note that your majority is 9,522. Are you considering a career change come 2024?
Well, I think when you've got a traditionally marginal seat, you always have to view every election with some trepidation. I'm selected here. I'm delighted to be fighting Rosendale and Darwen again. It's never an easy election here. You have to work really hard for people's votes. This is probably going to be the toughest election I've ever faced. I do think, though, if the Prime Minister does deliver on his promises, and I hugely support his work, his sort of early identification as inflation as the greatest enemy of the United Kingdom, he does deserve credit for, that we'll see a swing back to the Conservatives, and I hope and believe that the voters here in Rosendale and Darwen may just have one more roll of the dice with me. I'm certainly trying to persuade them anyway, Camilla.
One more question, actually. Bernard Jenkin, your Conservative colleague, has been described by other colleagues as a coward, according to a report in the Mail on Sunday. I know you're a fierce supporter of Boris Johnson. In going below radar and failing to address his own Partygate scandal, has Jenkin been a coward? Quick answer, Jake.
Yes.
Right. Thank you very much indeed for that. We do love it when politicians answer straight questions with straight answers. Thank you very much, Jake Berry. Lots more to come on today's Camilla Tominey show. I'm going to be speaking to Tony Blair's former Chief of Staff, Jonathan Powell, to discuss whether Sir Keir Starmer has got what it takes to secure a Labour victory. And I'm going to be joined by former Chancellor Kwasi Quateng. Don't go anywhere.
First and foremost, I'm a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to keep you entertained.
It's worth the drive because you get in and the team's all ready and waiting, they're itching to go, and it's a proper little family.
GB News is the people's channel.
It's the audience that makes the programme sing.
We're giving our viewers and our listeners a voice. I see the thousands of your letters, tweets, emails, you name it, coming in.
Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it?
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News has its own late-night paper preview show, Headliners, where comedians take you through the next day's top news stories. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper, we've got it covered for you. Headliners, every night at 11 p.m, and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us. From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Hi, I'm Dan Wootton. You can watch me live on GB News Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. And did you know that you can also watch and listen live on our website, gbnews.com. You'll always be up to date on the latest breaking news, as well as enjoying the best stories, opinions and shows. You can even join the debate under our live player as you're watching. So head straight to gbnews.com on TV, radio and online. GB News, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. Plenty more to come on today's Camilla Tominey show, including Tony Blair's former Chief of Staff, Jonathan Powell, who I'll be speaking to in just a minute. I'm also going to be joined in the studio by former Chancellor Quateng, who'll be discussing, well, inflation, of course, interest rates, and whether it was all his and Liz Truss's fault. I'm also going to be speaking to former Foreign Secretary Sir Malcolm Rifkind to provide analysis on the latest news on the Wagner Group's assault on Moscow. And Tony Abbott, former Prime Minister of Australia, will be in the studio for an exclusive interview. All that after the news with Tatiana Sanchez.
Camilla, thank you very much and good morning. This is the latest from the GB Newsroom. The Kremlin says the criminal charges against the leader of the Wagner mercenary group will be dropped and he'll go to Belarus. Yevgeny Prigozhin last night ordered his fighters to turn back from Moscow to avoid bloodshed. They were on their way to the city to remove Russian commanders that Prigozhin blames for mishandling the war in Ukraine. Local media has reported that all transport restrictions in the Rostov region have now been lifted. The Prime Minister has set out what he's calling the biggest workforce training expansion of the NHS. Writing in the Sunday Times, Mr Sunak said his NHS long-term workforce plan will aim to train, retain and reform the UK's experienced NHS staff. He says, as a country, we rely on attracting talented people from overseas rather than recruiting at home. Mr Sunak described the 15-year plan as the cornerstone of his government's vision for a better healthcare system. Several police forces have asked people not to call 999 after a technical fault is impacting a number of forces across the country. The Metropolitan Police says the system has been restored in the last few minutes, though. But in Greater Manchester, South Wales Police and in Scotland, officials said many emergency calls were not connecting. They're advising people to call 101 in an emergency for police and fire or 111 in a medical emergency. Jeremy Hunt is urging homeowners to be patient with recent interest rate hikes. Writing in the Mail on Sunday, the Chancellor says raising interest rates is one of the most effective methods of squashing inflation. He says he's absolutely committed to supporting the Bank of England and the government will take the necessary steps to curb inflation. The central bank this week issued its 13th interest rate hike in a row, this time by half a percentage point from 4.5% to 5%. In the sharpest increase since February. Human remains have been found where British actor Julian Sands went missing in the area of the San Gabriel Mountains near Los Angeles in the US. They've been transported to the local coroner's office pending positive identification. It's expected that should be completed by next week. The 65-year-old failed to return from a hike in the Mount Baldy area of the Southern Californian mountains on January 13th. And finally, the Princess of Wales teamed up with tennis champion Roger Federer to celebrate Wimbledon ball boys and girls. Kate joined the 8-time Wimbledon champion and watched a training session where youngsters were hoping to impress selectors and bag one of the 250 spots for the tournament next week. The Princess, who's the club's patron, has praised the hard work of the ball boys and girls, describing them as amazingly professional. This is GB News. We'll have more news as it happens. Now it's back to Camilla.
Welcome back. I'm going to be speaking to Jonathan Powell, former Downing Street Chief of Staff to former Prime Minister Tony Blair in just a moment. Stay tuned, don't go anywhere, because I've got Kwasi Quateng in the studio, former Chancellor of the Exchequer under Liz Truss, to talk about inflation and interest rates. Is it their fault? Is it down to the Bank of England? Is it the government? Is Rishi Sunak doing a good enough job? So that'll be a great interview in here in the studio in just a moment. I'm also going to be speaking to Sir Malcolm Rifkind, former Foreign Secretary, about the Russia situation. And I think Tony Abbott will have something to say about that too. He's the former Australian Prime Minister who once threatened to square up to Putin. So we'll be delighted to hear what he's got to say about the Wagner Group's attempted coup. But first, let's bring Jonathan Powell, former Downing Street Chief of Staff to former Prime Minister Tony Blair, into the conversation. Lovely to speak to you this morning, Mr. Powell. Now, I note that you were in post in 1999 when Putin became PM, then in 2000 when he became president. Did you ever meet him, Mr. Powell? What do you make of him and what do you make of the recent events in Russia?
Absolutely, yes, we did meet him. Tony Blair decided to be the first person actually to go and meet Putin when he was running for president in 1999. And we went to St. Petersburg, where Putin really pushed the boat out. He took us to see where he'd grown up in a rather squalid block of flats. He took us to the Peterhof, the palace of Peter the Great, and he took us to an opera where the French flag was trampled underfoot, which we very much enjoyed. So yes, we went to see Putin. He seemed like, after Yeltsin, a very normal Russian leader. Yeltsin had been a rather extraordinary character. The first time Tony Blair met him, he gave him a bear hug, which Tony thought was nice, until he didn't let go of him after a minute or two. So we were dealing with someone who seemed normal, but I watched him over time, in those 8 years actually, become more and more hubristic, cut off from reality, living in luxury, and more dictatorial. And around 2003, he changed. Tony Blair had a last meeting with him in 2007, where he sat with him in the margins of the G8 summit in Germany, and he wanted to tell him what he really thought. So he saw him by himself, and I went along, and Putin had a Russian interpreter. And I have to say, he complained about killing people on our territory, using nuclear material, about his autocracy. And Putin gave it back with 2 barrels. He was not apologetic at all. He was very, very tough and rough. And at that stage, I think he had become what he is today.
And what's your instinct about the effect of this attempted coup on his popularity and indeed longevity at the Kremlin? I mean, Prigozhin doesn't need to have been successful to have significantly weakened the Russian president. Are we entering the end game here, do you think, Jonathan?
I think it's early to tell exactly what the consequences of this are, because we don't know exactly what happened and how. But I think a couple of things are clear. Firstly, that it's not over. The Prigozhin still will hope he can have a future in Russia. He'd hope to become a leader himself in the future, and I think he still maintains that hope. And secondly, it's clearly weakened Putin. Putin had looked invulnerable. Now that invulnerability has been pierced, and that means there'll be others in the elite who've been waiting their time, who'll be looking for a chance. So I do think this has changed the equation as far as Putin is concerned. He no longer looks like he's going to be there forever. He's getting on a bit in years now. He's very cut off. And so that could be the beginning of the end. When we look back, this may be what we say tipped it over.
Just bring it back to Labour matters now. I note from YouGov polling over the weekend that actually Starmer's PM approval rating is higher than Rishi Sunak's. It's 10 points higher, it's on 32%. But it doesn't exactly inspire confidence that not sure is on 42%. I mean, has Starmer got the Blair factor? Do you worry that he doesn't have the charisma to take the party over the top when it comes to 2024?
He doesn't have the charisma of Tony Blair, but no, I don't worry about it, because I think what the public wants at the moment actually is a safe pair of hands. They had enough histrionics, enough drama over the last few years. And what they'd really like is someone who they can be confident, knows how to run things, has managed things in the past, and is going to be safe. And I think that's where Keir Starmer is going to win.
And what do you think of some of the policies? I mean, there was obviously controversy when they had to dampen down somewhat their £28 billion spending pledge on their Green Prosperity Plan. That amount of borrowing might seem lunacy in the face of the debt reaching 100% of GDP. They've also got this plan about, removing the tax breaks from private schools. They're talking about an Orgreave inquiry, which I wouldn't imagine is at the top of many people's to-do list, even if they are Labour voters. Have they got the right policies? What would you advise Starmer to do differently?
Well, I would advise him to do what we did, which was to be very cautious on the economic front. Traditionally, the public are very suspicious of the Labour Party on economic policy, because historically we didn't do very well with it. So if you remember, what we did in 97 was we stuck to Ken Clarke's spending plans for the first 2 years. It was a big problem for us because it gave us no room to put more money into the public services. But I'm sure it was the right thing to do because it reassured people that we were safe economically. So if I was advising Keir Starmer, which I'm not, I would tell him that he should focus on showing that economic stability, And I think with his Shadow Chancellor, he's got someone who really does inspire some confidence. So his number one task is to do that. The second thing I would advise him to do is not to have too much detail on policy. People don't expect much detail. They don't pay a lot of attention to the detail of policy. What they're interested in is a general sense of where you're going. You know, what's this guy like? What's he going to do? And having that sort of vision, I think, is the key thing that he needs to set out.
Is he also right this week to rule out tampering with the top rate of tax? I mean, it's quite hard for his deputy, Angela Rayner, to keep banging on about the top 1% if Keir Starmer isn't going to do anything about it. I mean, I know they've talked about windfall taxes and they seem to have spent that money several times over. But what about the top rate of tax?
Well, I don't really want to get into the detail of policy, not least because I'm not really competent to talk about it. But anything that helps reassure people that economically Labour Party is not going to be revolutionary, I think is sensible. If you want a Jeremy Corbyn-style series of policies to go into election, we know what happens. So I think trying to do what we did in '97 in terms of being safe and being stable and then sticking to that in government, which is what we did, will help a lot in Labour winning a decent-sized victory, which will allow it to have more than one term. The problem with Labour governments historically is they come in and they get chucked out after one term or 1.5 terms. So if Keir Starmer wants to bring about a real change, he needs a mandate, not just for one term, but for a couple of terms.
The other problem, isn't it, for Labour, is that if they do take power in 2024, they've got a very difficult in-trade to deal with. And as you say, they might not be given that time. How do they handle that? How do they handle their inheritance?
Well, it will be very difficult. When we came in, actually, it turned out in 1997, the economy was back growing again. In fact, if you remember, Bill Clinton won with It's the Economy is Stupid. It turns out that under George Bush, the economy was growing as well. We found out later when the figures were revised. So we had a relatively benign inheritance in terms of the economy. This is going to be much more difficult because this government has trashed the economy in a really serious way, plus the international impact that's affecting all of us. And so any incoming government is going to have to be very cautious economically, going to have to reassure people and going to have to rebuild. And there won't be much scope for adventurous policies, I don't think.
Final question. I was interested to read this week, Keir Starmer, on one hand, having talked about abolishing the House of Lords, was then hinting at perhaps ennobling both Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. Should he do that? And would they accept, do you think?
I have no idea if they'd accept, but I would point out that Tony Blair did not have a dissolution honours list. He did not put people in the House of Lords. The memory of the lavender list from Harold Wilson's days is still very prevalent. What Boris Johnson did, frankly, is pretty scandalous, to be honest. And so I think less of that would be better. I think, as far as I could tell from the newspapers, what they were talking about is if they come into government and the House of Lords frustrates them because so many Tory peers have been made, so many Liberals and others, then they wanted to have the numbers. I personally would be in favour of abolishing the House of Lords, not reforming it. Having two different mandates is a really serious problem for our democracy.
But in principle, Lord Blair, is that something that appeals?
It doesn't appeal to me. I have no idea if it would appeal to him.
OK. Jonathan Powell, I'm really grateful for your time this morning. Lovely to speak to you. Thank you. Now, as billed, I'm joined in the studio now by Kwasi Quateng, former Chancellor of the Exchequer under Liz Truss. Let's put that to you now, because Jonathan Powell is talking about Conservatives having trashed the economy. I'm going to go for your juggler, but I'm going to say, because the viewers and the listeners might be thinking this, is everything that's going on with inflation and interest rates your fault and Liz Truss's fault?
No, I don't think so at all. I mean, if you look back, and you mentioned this yourself, at the end of November 2021, which wasn't a million years ago, it was only 18 months ago, the interest of the bank rate was at 0.1%. And what happened was that we had huge public spending because of COVID. As Rishi Sunak observed, I remember talking to him when he was Chancellor, inflation was a problem.
Yes.
And I'm afraid I'm one of those who thinks the bank was a bit slow in reacting to it. And in fact, Andrew Bailey himself acknowledged that he and his colleagues had made a mistake in terms of their forecasts.
Let's talk about Andrew Bailey, because George Osborne has claimed that she, Truss, dismissed the economic establishment. She fired the permanent secretary at the Treasury. She went around telling everyone, as did her Chancellor, that's you, I believe, Kwasi, that the Bank of England governor was, quote, useless.
No, I never said anything about it.
Do you think he's useless?
No, I don't.
Do you think he's a Treasury stooge?
I think he essentially represents the orthodoxy that Liz Truss was against.
Yeah.
And I think there's still an issue with the problems we were trying to solve. I mean, I'm very struck by the fact that nobody's talking about growth. We're always firefighting. We're always talking about obviously having to deal with inflation. We've got to put up interest rates to do that. The whole growth agenda has been sidelined.
Do you think Treasury officials are pushing for recession?
No, I don't think they are as such. I think there'll be one or two people who probably think actually a recession would be quite a good idea because then we would deal with inflation.
I mean, I'm not an economist, I'm a journalist, and therefore my mathematics is poor, as you can imagine, Kwasi, but at the same time, the idea of a recession being preferable strikes me as economic lunacy. What do you think?
It's mad, but let me be very clear. I don't think that's the corporate view. I just think there are one or two, you hear it whisperings.
But Jeremy Hunt seems to be slightly hinting at it.
I don't know what Jeremy meant by his remarks, but I think, openly to will a recession when you're responsible for an economy is not responsible.
Can you give us a greater impression of what it was like when you were trying to push some of these more radical policies?
Sure.
We've heard Jake Berry earlier talking about blobonomics.
Blobonomics, yes.
So you're Chancellor, you're saying we want to do something really radical, we want to go against the grain, we want to return to a period of Thatcherite economics.
Well, that sort of thing, yeah.
What's the... Just please explain what the pushback is like.
I think that you're dealing with institutions where there are thousands of people, they've been set in their ways. Many of them were appointed in the New Labour time, so they're sort of continuity New Labour, if you like.
OK, so what are you saying? There are lefties in the Treasury?
Well, they're not lefties. They're people who believe that, they're not as averse to high taxes as I and Liz Truss were. And you're dealing with these institutions, and you've got to work... Ultimately, we learned the hard way that you've got to work with them. And I think that the actual goal that we set out, a low-tax, dynamic economy, is something that we should still be working for.
But were you withholding information from them, or were they withholding information from you? Because obviously you were criticised for not including the OBR and for sacking Tom Scholar and for maybe keeping some of your policies under wraps, because I guess you didn't want them to be immediately turned upon. But at the same time, I've kind of got the impression over the course of recent months that Liz Truss thinks that stuff wasn't explained to her, for instance, about LDIs.
The LDI thing was not known about. And that only became a problem when it was a problem. So it was not something that was identified. My own view about the mini-budget, looking back, was that things were at a blistering pace. I mean, Liz Truss was only appointed on the 6th of September, and I delivered the mini-budget on the 23rd of September. And in the meantime, we had, the tragic event of the passing of Her late Majesty and the funeral and all the rest of it. So 2.5 weeks where things were going very, very fast indeed. And actually, my own view has always been that you've got to try and slow things down to make sure that you prepare the pitch. That was the David Cameron.
Although you did the doubling down, didn't you, on the Sunday?
I did.
Do you regret that now?
No, I think my words were slightly misinterpreted.
And when I say that, just to explain to viewers and listeners, you were sort of told, would you go further with tax cuts? And you said, yeah, maybe.
Yeah, but
the markets are spooked.
Yeah, but the issue before that was that we'd said that we would have we'd have statement on spending. I'd said in the statement on the Friday that there was going to be a further statement looking at the spending side and trying to show spending restraint. Now, my own view is that, in retrospect, we should have done them together in a normal, a classic budget. We should have had the spending restraint, as Jeremy Hunt announced at the end of last year, as well as the tax cuts together, to show that the tax cuts weren't entirely unfunded. That was my view.
OK.
That is my view now. I mean,
what do you think of things like furlough and the energy bailout? I ask because whenever the Conservatives give people money, they never get thanked for it.
No.
You've still got the left going on about cuts and austerity when you've actually spent too much money. That's why you're in this mess. Were some of these policies a mistake in retrospect? Spending too much on furlough. There's now talk of mortgage bailouts. I mean, that would be having renters bailing out the haves, the people who actually own property.
That's right.
Why at every turn are people talking about bailouts?
I think COVID, and we've got to remember what happened with COVID, completely changed people's perception of what the government could do. And I think going into COVID, we were spending a lot less money. We were a much more nimble economy, I would say. And then as a consequence of COVID, we spent hundreds of billions. I think it was something like £400 billion.
In retrospect, it was too much.
Well, it's easy to say with hindsight.
I know.
But actually at the time, we were being criticised again for not doing enough. And I think the Treasury, the Chancellor at the time, Rishi, now Prime Minister, actually did respond very quickly. I think, and I have to say this, Rishi was very right about the inflation. I remember him talking to that about me when I was business secretary. Yeah. And he said, look, inflation is a big problem. The bank, I think, has been slightly less alive to that problem.
Are we now a poor country masquerading as a rich one? I mean, it feels like we are kind of like the inflation beast of the West. Our inflation rate is high.
It's high.
The Americans got a handle on it much earlier. We're sort of heavily indebted. We've got a kind of population thinking that they deserve pay rises for working at home more and that they need to be bailed out of their mortgage bills. We can't afford to do any of this stuff.
No, it's not sustainable, I think. And I think we're going to have to talk about growth. We're going to have to talk about growing the economy. And I hate to sort of bang on about this, but the only way we're going to actually have good public services is if we can afford to pay for them. And the only way we can afford to pay for those is by growing the economy so that we get more tax receipts from a buoyant economy.
Has Jeremy Hunt got a point, and indeed Rishi Sunak in the week, in saying the best tax cut we can give the public is a fall in inflation?
I think they're right to focus on inflation because you've got to remember that the inflation target is 2%. That's 2%. So, and now, as Jake said, it's 8.7%.
He's not going to deliver on this deliverable by the end of the year.
Well, let's see.
Get it down to 5%, do you think he will?
It's challenging. It's challenging. I think he can. I think we've got...
Really?
I think he can. I think these... In America, inflation fell very quickly.
What's your prediction as to what will happen with interest rates? I mean, they're now at 5%. There's talk of 6%. How long for?
Well, the market is expecting 6%. I mean, that's well known. That's out there. But as I say, it's all to do with the inflation rate. If the inflation rate falls more quickly than people expect, I don't think you're going to see massively increased interest rates.
But is there this sense that they were ultra low for far too long, and actually the status quo should be to have an interest rate around 3 to 4%? We're all lulled into this false sense of security that debt is cheap and therefore it lasts forever.
Yeah, there's no doubt that we had a period where we had exceptionally low rates. I mean, I remember at the end of 2021, I was business secretary. The interest rate was 0.1%, and it was only moved in November. 0.1, so it's 50 times higher, the interest rate, than it was in October 2021, and that's not very long ago. So they were very, very low rates. And just to recap on the history, obviously we had the 2008 crash, the financial crisis. They went very low then, and then, of course, after COVID, the economy was essentially in lockdown. And we needed to have a period of essentially cheap money to get things going again.
But the Bank of England printed too much money. Quantitative easing was too high.
That's clearly what is very likely to have happened. The fact that we were printing money and spending it as well led to this increased inflation. And as a consequence of the increased inflation, we're essentially playing catch up with the interest rates.
What was your reaction to Mark Carney blaming Brexit?
I thought that was slightly bizarre. I mean, it's well known that Mark has always been against Brexit. But to blame Brexit for everything that's gone wrong, I think, is completely unrealistic. In fact, as someone who supported Brexit, I look at the vaccine rollout. I look at a lot of the stuff we're doing in foreign affairs. And that the fact that we're out has already shown that we have an independence.
I know, but you, like me, shared this sort of dream of a low corporation tax rate to be more competitive with the likes of France or Germany.
Sure.
I mean, I don't know if you advocated Singapore on sea from a deregulation standpoint, but this was meant to make us much more dynamic and forward-facing and a world leader in global trade. None of that's materialised. It's a failure of Tory government, isn't it?
Well, we tried. And actually, I'm one of those people, I've been to Singapore. It's always being traduced as some evil place where there's sweatshops. Singapore is a really prosperous place. And if you look at 60 years ago, it was nothing. It was literally just a kind of malarial swamp, as it was described.
Yes.
And what they've achieved is amazing. So when I hear people, the left particularly, saying how bad Singapore is, I just think that's one of the great human success stories of the 20th century.
So and we should be trying to
Well, I would have liked to have seen a more dynamic, I would still like to see a more dynamic economy, an economy where people are incentivised, an economy where people feel happy to invest in the UK. And not to say that, there is still investment in the UK, but I think we could be doing even better.
Final question, because I can feel a government U-turn in my bones. This £170 green levy, you had suggested that it shouldn't be put on taxpayers' energy bills because they're already suffering. We've now got the government saying that they want people to pay this £170 in green levies. What do you think they should do?
So the view, certainly last autumn when I was still in government, was that it should be absorbed in the general tax. It shouldn't be put specifically on bill payers because the bills already were very high.
So should they U-turn on this? It's a wrong.
Well, I don't know what that.
I mean, they're saying put it on bills, and people are saying, well, my bills are already sky high, and now I can't pay my mortgage.
There's been a bit of mixed messaging, but I mean, I understand where it's coming from because as Energy Minister, I was very focused on trying to get new technologies, green technologies, up and running. So I understand the need to subsidise new technologies, but at the same time, at this moment, particularly last autumn when energy bills were very high, I think it was a bit too much to expect people to pay an extra £170.
Do you reckon if
levy.
Liz Truss has stayed the course, we'd be in a better situation economically now?
Look, I think, there are challenges. There are always challenges in government. And, I was very disappointed, obviously, to be dismissed.
Yes.
I thought, when I was dismissed, I thought that was the end. I thought, I didn't see the point of it. But I think we'd still be facing difficult challenges. But she had a lot of drive and purpose. And I think this growth question isn't going to go away. We're going to look back in 3 or 4 years' time and say, how are we going to grow this economy? And I think that's a really important debate to be had. And I don't hear any of it now. I just hear a lot of firefighting, a lot of, dealing with current problems, which is understandable.
Kwasi, thank you very, very much for joining me this morning.
Thank you.
Really lovely to speak to you. Now, let's go back to Uxbridge, where Catherine Forster is with the People's Panel. I'd love to know what the people there in Uxbridge have made of my interviews. Catherine.
Hello, Camilla. Yes, we're still here at the Harris and Hall coffee shop in Uxbridge. We're listening with great interest to what the politicians had to say. And coming to you first, Philip, you do have a little bit of sympathy, don't you, for the predicament that the government finds itself in?
Yeah, I think if we're all reasonable, we have to understand that they've come in off a very, very difficult few years with the Eat Out to Help Out, the furlough schemes, etc., the pandemic. However, notwithstanding that, I think it's very unreasonable in order for them to look at things like recessions as being options for this current mortgage crisis. I just think that is a complete knee-jerk reaction and not a solution at all. And I think they should be much more dynamic as far as what Kwasi was saying about their policies. They really need to be more dynamic with what they're offering.
Jake Berry was suggesting the reintroduction of mortgage interest relief at source MIRIS. Do you think that's A, a good idea, and B, likely to happen?
It's very difficult because I don't think there's anything like a good idea at the moment. It really is just firefighting at the moment. It tends to kick the can down the road when you look at those type of schemes. But I think that mortgage lenders and their products can be very dynamic. And I really think that it could be a time where we need to look at the actual equity within properties and have some sort of equity release offset against the actual mortgage rate that people are paying.
No easy answers, as you say. Very, very difficult indeed. And John, Camilla put your question very directly to John Glenn about do they understand? Do you think that they do?
I'm so angry. I just can't believe that he came out with that. The Bank of England puts up the interest rates. They go and speak to the banks, and they offer three things that we've already got. We've got interest-only mortgage, which we've already got. We've already got the 6-month holiday period. We had that during COVID. That's generally available anyway. And the last thing they offered, I can't even remember what it was, but it's we're going to have a slow death. We're going to be allowed to have our house repossessed within 12 months rather than 6. I just can't believe it. So out of touch. Just so angry. We need to vote for anybody but the three main parties in this election because there's 14 other candidates. And I think if we vote for them, we'll be telling everybody that it's none of the above. Just don't want this. Sorry, I'm really angry. Really angry.
No, fair enough. I think a lot of people feel very, very disaffected. I should say, in the interest of transparency,
I'm boiling, absolutely boiling.
You are a spokesman for the Reform Party, who, of course, are not standing in Uxbridge.
No,
They've
we're not.
stood down
We're
for
not.
Lawrence Fox's reclaim. But thank you for that. OK, let's talk now to Thomas. Thomas, you are a constituent here. Have you decided who you're going to vote for, or are you indeed going to vote?
Well, it's definitely not going to be for Conservative because they've been here long enough and they've messed everything up. You know, the economy, the pandemic, the amount of money they've thrown around. And great point you made, sympathy. Yeah, there was a lot of money given out, furlough, etc. But we just seem to be going backwards and backwards and backwards. And it's a shame because the most vulnerable, and especially people who've got mortgages, they've paid those mortgages for 20 odd years and they could lose their house like in less than 12 months. So they lose everything, all the deposit they put down, every investment they've put down to it, and then they become homeless, and it just exacerbates things because then they've got to be rehoused as well.
A lot of people losing sleep, I imagine, at the moment. And just very quickly, obviously with your experience of the NHS and as a constituent of the former PM, you weren't impressed with Partygate.
No, I wasn't, because he had COVID, and yet look what he done. And he lied all the way through it, and we all knew that, and they procrastinated with it. And I just think they should all be sacked, because anybody else in a normal job that done something like that would automatically be sacked.
So an unimpressed People's panel, I'm afraid, Camilla, from here in Uxbridge today.
Great job, Catherine. I can feel John's anger from here over in Paddington. He's absolutely seething. And I think lots of people can empathise and sympathise with his position. Now, lots more to come on today's show. In just a minute, I'm going to be quizzing former Foreign Secretary Sir Malcolm Rifkind on the latest coming out of Russia. Don't go anywhere. I'll be back soon.
Like all families, we have arguments every now and then, but actually we agree on what the mission of GB News is, and that's the most fundamentally important thing.
GB News provides the kind of platform that lets all voices be heard. We don't hold back. We're free to say what we really think.
Just because some people who live in a tiny little Westminster bubble think that their particular story is important, that's not the most important story for me.
And often there will be difficult stories that you won't find on the establishment media.
Because what people think in the north of England may be very different to what they're thinking in the home counties.
We're going to carry on telling the world what life is really like for households up and down the UK.
We love to be in your car, in your kitchen as you're having your breakfast. Whatever you're doing, you are part of the show. If it matters to you, it matters to us.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates. Do you not believe in prison?
I don't believe in prisons.
I'm completely stunned. I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed. So I guess they've always been quite woke. That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Nightmare commute. Kick it up a gear with me, Patrick Christie's, at drive time, 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News Radio. You can listen online and on DAB+, on the smart speaker app and on the GB News app. And if you've got an Alexa, all you have to say is, Alexa, play GB News. We're also on TuneIn and the Radio Blair apps. From the school run to rush hour, get revved up with me, Patrick Christie's, on GB News and GB News Radio.
So Jubes and Kerr, we tackle the issues of the day with real robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is 2 new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat. Did you know Kate Moss?
Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to the Camilla Tominey Show. Now, I'm delighted to be joined in the studio by Sir Malcolm Rifkind, former Foreign Secretary, the perfect man to take us through what has recently happened in Russia. Sir Malcolm, lovely to see you this morning.
Thank you very much.
What's your initial reaction to what's gone on over the last 24 to 48 hours?
Well, 24 hours ago, I would have said this is the most extraordinary event that has happened, but I was wrong. 24 hours later, it's even more extraordinary, because Putin, by his lack of real leadership, has totally humiliated himself. Yesterday morning, he came on in the Kremlin, speaking to the Russian people, saying this was treason, this is mutiny, they will be crushed, Prigozhin will be arrested and dealt with properly. Within hours, Prigozhin is pardoned to leave peacefully. The Wagner Group now goes back as the Wagner Group.
Yes.
And why does that happen? It happens because he did not have the military capability, despite this vast army he's got, of stopping a city like Rostov with 1 million people being occupied, 40 miles from the border.
Yes. So reading between the lines, what do you think has happened? He's bunged Prigozhin a shed load of cash, got Lukashenko to broker some deal, but isn't Prigozhin now a dead man walking?
No, I don't actually think he is. First of all, I doubt if there was any cash required. Prigozhin is already incredibly wealthy because of various business opportunities he's had.
38 million is found in bags in St. Petersburg.
It wasn't about cash. No, he's not a dead man walking. Well, he might be bumped off, that is obviously possible, but that was always, in theory, a possibility. And Prigozhin is not the issue. Forgive me, because the real issue is whether Putin's authority has been totally destroyed. It was already on the slide because of the failures in the Ukraine war. Now, what was extraordinary yesterday, when he made his great speech in the Kremlin, he compared what was happening to 1917.
Yes.
And why? Because 2 years later, he said the Tsar was overthrown, as if he was the Tsar. And, well, in a sense, predicting his own demise if this wasn't done.
What a spectacular own goal. But why would he say that?
He's lost the plot.
He's losing it. But what do you put that down to? Too long in power? Not well?
Yes. Uneasy as the head that wears the crown. He's a one-man band. There's no party he represents. There's no national movement he represents in substance. He's a one-man dictator. You see that when he sits at the end of these very long tables. And his cabinet colleagues are about half a mile away, not allowed to be near the Tsar. So when you're in that situation, your judgment becomes slowly warped. He's not crazy. That would be a mistake. He's rational in his own terms, but he has become obsessed with his own power and with his own survival, but he's failed to provide leadership. It's been known for months that Prigozhin was a menace to him. Prigozhin was slagging out his defense minister, his chief of staff, in the most crude,
calling Putin, I think yesterday, granddad.
Well, he never deliberately attacked Putin, but it was obvious if you are condemning the way the war is being run, and it's Putin's war, and he has the overall control, you may attack the defense minister or the chief of staff. It's actually Putin indirectly you're attacking. And despite that, Putin neither had the power nor the will to actually intervene from a position of strength to sort out this mess. And he tried to sort of distance himself from it. I am above this. Let these minions sort this out themselves. And that would be bad in peacetime. It's disastrous when you're fighting a war.
And what does the West do? Watch and see how this plays out.
Well, this particular one, this is internal. It has major external consequences. It has consequences of a very encouraging kind for the Ukraine conflict. But you don't intervene in this. You don't entreat on private grief. Let them not sort it out, because he's not sorted it out. He's tried to push it off to a later day. But throughout Russia, millions of ordinary Russians in the army, a million soldiers, will be saying to themselves, what sort of president is this? When you have an invasion of Russia itself, a city of 1 million people, 40 miles from the border, and there aren't even any Russian troops in between.
But are the Russian people ready for change?
We are always told, and it's historically correct, that Russians, partly because of their history and their culture, like strong leadership. And it is equally correct that for the first 10, 15 years of his presidency, Putin provided that. The Yeltsin years were looked back as chaotic. Yeltsin himself was an alcoholic. And Putin, at first, seemed to be delivering what Russia needed. And he, in a sense, was delivering that. The economy improved and so forth. The last 5 years have been very bad. And it's basically, you know, that famous saying, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And that is what has happened with Putin. He didn't have experience of the army. He was never in the army, and yet he is in charge of a war. He was never a diplomat. He was a spook. He was a KGB man. So he's not stupid. but he's got limited ability, limited knowledge.
So what's the most likely scenario? He's obviously weakened. Parts of the public may be turning against him, or at least being increasingly sceptical about his leadership. Is he then the subject of a coup from within the Kremlin?
Well, we don't know, and I'm not going to pretend I know any more than anybody else. But if you ask me what I think is the most likely scenario, and it may be in 3 months' time, it may not be for another year or 2 years. Remember, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, it was a year after the Soviets had failed that Khrushchev was just quietly removed by his own colleagues in the Politburo and sent off to his dacha to retire. Now, at some stage, and it could be, these things tend to accelerate once the process begins, at some stage, a group of the most senior Russians around Putin, it's not going to be a popular uprising.
No.
It's not going to be the army over a military coup.
Yeah.
It'll be a mixture of some generals, some FSB, intelligence agency people, some of the oligarchs, and they will say, Comrade Vladimir, we think it's time perhaps for you to retire to your dacha.
Tap on a shoulder.
A tap on the shoulder. And if you're one man, however many people you've got protecting you, once they stop wanting to protect you, there's nothing you can do about it.
And Sir Malcolm, finally, where does this leave President Zelensky and the Ukraine war, do you think? I mean, Wagner now goes back to support the Russian troops.
Well, we don't know for certain exactly what's going to happen, but that is indeed the likelihood. But how's that going to work? No, where we probably go from here, in terms of Ukraine, the Ukrainians are already in their counter-offensive. That was always going to be very difficult because it's much easier to defend than to recover ground in an offensive, because the enemy digs in, and that's indeed what we're seeing at the moment. What's happened in the last 24 hours will certainly make it a lot easier. Another blow to the morale of the Russian troops, another opportunity for the Ukrainians to identify points of weakness. When you have a momentum on your side, and when you have huge morale on your side, then that usually accounts for a lot. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to sweep the Russians out of Crimea, but my best guess would be in the next 2 or 3 months, they will recover a significant amount of lost territory. The big prize will be if they can get back to the Sea of Azov, and cut the land bridge between Russia and Crimea. That's the most likely objective that they have.
I want the just briefest answer to the next question very quickly, because you are Foreign and former Defence Secretary. This blocking by Biden of Ben Wallace being head of NATO, was it a bad decision?
It wasn't Biden's decision. It's presented by the Daily Telegraph that way, and it's a silly headline.
Daily Telegraph?
It's a silly,
right about everything all the time, so
well, it was a silly headline because nobody is against Ben Wallace. He's a great guy. The Americans think he would be a perfectly good Secretary General, but there was a growing... It's got to be unanimous of all 30 member states, and a lot of countries wanted somebody either from Eastern Europe or perhaps a woman as Secretary General for the first time.
All right, thank you very much indeed, Sir Malcolm Rifkind, for joining me this morning. Now, up next, we have an exclusive interview with former Australian Prime Minister Tony Abbott, the man who stopped the votes. Don't go anywhere, I'll be back soon.
First and foremost, I am a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to keep you entertained.
It's worth the drive because you get in and the team's all ready and waiting, they're itching to go, and it's a proper little family.
GB News is the People's Channel.
It's the audience that makes the programme sing.
We're giving our viewers and our listeners a voice. I see the thousands of your letters, tweets, emails, you name it, coming in.
Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it?
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle.
Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News has its own late-night paper preview show, Headliners, where comedians take you through the next day's top news stories. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper, we've got it covered for you. Headliners, every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Hi, I'm Dan Wootton. You can watch me live on GB News Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. And did you know that you can also watch and listen live on our website, gbnews.com. You'll always be up to date on the latest breaking news, as well as enjoying the best stories, opinions and shows. You can even join the debate under our live player as you're watching. So head straight to gbnews.com on TV, radio and online. GB News, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to the Camilla Tominey Show. I'm delighted to say that joining me now in the studio is former Australian Prime Minister Tony Abbott, the man who famously stopped the boats. And I hear Tony, or I recall, famously tried to square up to Putin back when MH17 was downed by the Russians. You've met this guy. What's your thoughts on what's happened in the last 48 hours and how long he can cling on in the Kremlin?
There's no doubt, Camilla, that Putin regards himself as on a mission from God to recreate the Russia of Peter the Great. And that's why the Ukraine war is so important, because if Ukraine were to fall back into the Russian orbit, there's no doubt that the Baltic states, Georgia, Moldova and Poland would be next, because as far as he's concerned, these are the greater Russian motherlands, and he feels that his mission is to get them back. He thinks that the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century was the breakup of the old Soviet Union, and that's why he's such a very dangerous person who does have to be stopped.
Although, is he less dangerous or more dangerous this morning? I mean, obviously this attempted coup has very much weakened his position. It's made Russians question whether he should go on any longer. What's your view?
Well, we don't really know exactly what's happened. Obviously, there is a problem between him and the Wagner Group. It can't help but do damage. But on the other hand, there's still a long way for this to play out. The Ukrainians are doing their best to punch their way through very significant Russian defences right now. I don't think any of us can be happy until every last inch of Ukraine is liberated from every last Russian soldier.
Were you of the opinion at the time when Crimea was invaded that the West was a bit asleep at the wheel? I mean, did we do too much to try and bring Putin in? Well, actually, we should have been more wary of what he was capable of.
Camilla, this is the second invasion. The first invasion took place in 2014. And frankly, it was a very tepid response back then. Then, of course, in the week before February the 24th, you had people like President Biden saying that maybe a minor incursion could be tolerated. Since the invasion, I think that the West, in many respects led by Britain, has responded magnificently. But in the end, the Ukrainians can't win without help, because they need the heavy weaponry to match the heavy weaponry that the Russians have got in abundance. It's great that tanks and longer range missiles and armoured vehicles and what have you have been supplied, but they do need more. The problem at the moment is that they don't have, not only do they lack air superiority, but it's even hard to contest the airspace, given that they just don't have enough modern aircraft. And I think if the West is serious about ensuring that the Ukrainians have a win rather than just a bloody stalemate, jets such as the F-16 have to be provided.
Is Biden just too weak?
I don't say he's too weak, but I think there is a degree of caution on the part of NATO collectively. Some countries are more forward-leaning. The Poles and the Eastern Europeans are very forward-leaning. Britain has been very forward-leaning. The French and the Germans have been the laggards here. Joe Biden has been trying to keep the show together. But in the end, Ukraine is fighting for the freedom of all of us, and all of us should do our bit to help. If they're the ones that are going to have to fight and die, at the very least, we can give them the weapons they need to win.
Let's bring it back to domestic matters now. I know you've been in the UK for some time. You were at an event that Boris Johnson was speaking at earlier in the week. What's your characterisation of how Rishi Sunak is doing right now?
It's very difficult to be the fifth Prime Minister in a continuum of government. I think he's doing a very good job under, excuse me, difficult circumstances. I always say that the important thing is to create a contest. That's how I succeeded as an opposition leader, and I tried to continue as Prime Minister. Create a contest with the other side. And
do you think he should be deploying more attack lines on Labour? I mean, Frank Luntz apparently gave the Conservative Party, the 1922 committee, some advice, and they said, you're just going to have to go negative because no one's being positive about conservatism right now.
I think that the negative is important in politics, but you've also got to have a positive agenda of your own. If the Conservatives get another term, what is going to be different and better? Are they going to, for instance, drop the ban on diesel and petrol-powered cars?
I mean, do you think it's foolhardy, this net zero target, the Conservatives concentrating on green levies, putting green levies on energy bills? We're already struggling with our energy bills.
Well, certainly if this was back in Australia and it was the coalition that was doing this, I'd be very much against it. I don't want to be giving too much explicit advice to a brother political party. But in the end, what's more important, keeping the lights on or getting emissions down? What's more important, keeping your industries alive or this green nirvana that we're all aiming for? And my fear is that it's only in the West that we obsess about emissions. China's not worried about it. Russia's not worried about it. India is not that worried about it because they're concerned with giving their people affordable, reliable power so that they can lift them out of poverty. And it does, I've got to say, look a lot like a green vanity project on the part of the West. And I don't believe that we should continue with green vanity projects, particularly when they're doing so much, they're putting so much extra costs on our economy.
Let me ask you about immigration. Obviously, we've got this vow from Rishi Sunak that's very much reminiscent of your vow to stop the boats. So far, no one's been deported to Rwanda. Do you think they're executing this policy adequately? It's not working for them, is it?
Well, again, I think they're on the right track. One of the things that the Howard government did and then my government did was we had offshore processing. We sent people to Nauru and to PNG. I think all credit to the British government for getting this deal with Rwanda. But it's not much of a deal if you can't actually get the people to take off and land in Rwanda. And
so what does he need to do? Be more bullish with the courts? Just push it through and be robust?
The British Parliament is sovereign, and I can't understand why the British Parliament hasn't passed a law removing the jurisdiction of this European tribunal over British policy. Look, the other thing that we did in Australia was we turned boats around because in the end, if people can get here, they will be tempted to come here.
So should we be doing that in the Channel, turning them around?
I appreciate that France is a different country to Indonesia, and we were turning boats around back to Java. But to be honest, Camilla, it's frankly an unfriendly act on the part of the French not to police these camps better, not to stamp out the people smuggling gangs better. And if the French aren't prepared to do their job, if the French are prepared to, at least in part, facilitate what, at a sufficiently large scale, starts to become a peaceful invasion, well, I think Britain must be prepared to say, well, they're coming from France. They have no right to come from France. The way is shut. We send them back.
OK. Now, I'm intrigued that you gave this speech in London earlier this week where you asked, what has gone wrong with centre-right politics? Is it our leaders or our beliefs, or has the world changed? What was your conclusion?
Well, it's a bit of all three, but I think that there is a way forward. I think we need leaders with conviction and courage. We need to actually believe in our beliefs as opposed to pay them lip service. And the fundamental beliefs of the centre-right of politics are freedom, tradition, and above all else, country. These are the things we stand for: greater freedom, support for tradition, but above all else, we are the patriot parties. And the difficulty today is that just as Reagan and Thatcher were confronting Marxism as represented by the old Soviet Union, we are confronting a kind of cultural Marxism, which is rampant inside our institutions. In a sense, it's a more insidious and a more difficult enemy because it's internal, but wherever we see this neo-Marxism, whether it's in the climate cult, the gender fluidity, whatever,
we have to fight
got to stand against it.
Tony Abbott, thank you so much. Sorry to wrap it up so quickly. Angela Rippon's next with The Portillo Show. Stay tuned.
Like all families, we have arguments every now and then.